Tonight, on Closer Look, it's been a wild and crazy week in politics in this country. It started with the Prime Minister announcing his resignation, to President-elect Donald Trump wanting to make Canada its 51st state, and Premier Doug Ford trying to combat potential U.S. tariffs that Ford hinted might lead to an early election. Sinead Dougal, our deputy editor at the Trillium, is with us to unpack it all and joins us tonight from Toronto. Sinead, welcome to the program. Let's start with potential tariffs. The Premier floated the idea of an election when he made a comment that he doesn't have a mandate to spend tens of billions of dollars to counter potential tariffs from incoming U.S. President-elect Donald Trump. Why does he feel his current majority government isn't well enough equipped?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, Scott. The premier has been keeping everyone on their toes with this election speculation since last year, and that was already happening before Trump threatened to put tariffs on Canadian goods. So it could be that they're still considering it an early election. There is the turmoil in Ottawa that is a big factor in all this, but now the Ford government could be viewing the tariff situation as a new reason to justify an early election if that's what they decide to do. One of the things that the premier did mention yesterday is that he thinks the tariffs are coming and that it's one thing if they last several weeks, but if they last months, that's when he feels like he's going to have to step in and pour billions into the economy, similar to during the pandemic. And we did have the last provincial election during the pandemic. So now there's this new threat, and they could have to spend a lot of money. And yes, they have a majority, but it seems like they're setting themselves up to potentially say, well, we didn't run on this in the last election, and we need to ask Ontarians. So at this point, he's really just kind of continuing to fuel this speculation about an early election by saying he doesn't have the mandate to spend billions to deal with the possible tariffs.
And the Premier avoided ruling out an election during the federal prorogation period. Opposition parties are of the opinion that he's using the tariff situation to justify a potential early election. What is his response to that accusation?
So we did hear from a Liberal MPP yesterday who said he thinks the reason the PCs could be looking at an election um, it isn't to get consensus from people, but rather to get a longer mandate. And the premier was asked about this during a scrum with reporters yesterday, and whether his comments about the mandate indicated an election as early as February. And he said that's not what he's saying, but then he repeated that he needs a mandate from the people, similar to during the pandemic. And when he was asked, how do you get a mandate without an election? He sort of sidestepped that and said, well, those are your comments, not mine, to the reporter.
All right, now it's no secret that the threat of tariffs could have potentially a catastrophic impact on the economy. Let's talk specifically Ontario. How might these tariffs affect industries in this province?
Yeah, so the premier has said that if tariffs are imposed, it would really be devastating for Canada, but particularly Ontario. When Trump first floated the idea of tariffs, he spoke of tariffs on kind of all Canadian goods. So it's unclear at this point whether if these tariffs do hit, would they in fact be on all products or just certain ones and therefore affect only certain sectors. But there are a lot of industries concerned at this point that really rely on cross-border trade. One is the auto sector. You have cars and parts crossing the border with the US constantly, and car parts sometimes crossing several times before they finally end up in a vehicle. And as the auto sector tries to move to electric vehicles, these additional costs could really hit companies and people hard. But then you also have the ripple effect that we could see in other areas. So raw materials like steel that are needed for car parts. There could be other sectors like softwood lumber, and if tariffs are slapped on that, it could really affect some smaller communities. And then there's also mining, with some communities really depending on mineral exports to the US. So we're talking about things like iron ore, nickel. So if these become more expensive, there could be less demand on the US side for these products.
All right, so to counter the threat of tariffs, the premier made somewhat of a counter proposal to Donald Trump, a partnership of sorts. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the premier has been trying to push this idea of what he calls Fortress AMCAN, so America, Canada, and describing this as essentially a renewed alliance of sorts between the two countries. He said yesterday, and I quote, "Let's stop wasting time on ridiculous ideas about merging and instead focus on efforts on restoring the pride of made in Canada and made in USA." And he was referring to Trump's suggestion of Canada becoming part of the US. The province has said that a cornerstone of this, Fortress AmCan plan is to boost energy security between the two countries and thus creating economic growth on both sides of the border. So the provincial government laid out ways this week that they think this can be achieved, including by, for example, creating, what they described as a cross-border working group with Canadian and US lawmakers and experts to look at things like regulations on both sides, to really try to bring regulations in line with each other to get rid of red tape for building things like energy infrastructure. So, those are just some of the things that they've been talking about.
All right, finally, the premier was involved in a collision on the 401 Wednesday, returning from an event. What happened and how bad was it, and how's he doing?
So the way the premier described that was that their car was sideswept on the highway. He said that they just got hammered and that it was bad. The premier was okay, as are the staff and the OPP officers who were with him. The premier's office did say that they believe the driver of the other vehicle was treated for non-life-threatening injuries. But the premier yesterday did mention that the other car ended up on the other side of the highway. So, I mean, at this point, that's kind of what we know, but hopefully they're okay.
And I think he made a quip that it's hard to hurt a head that's similar to that of limestone.
Yes, he did.
Well, we're glad that everybody's okay. Sinead Dougal, deputy editor at the Trillium, on tonight's Closer Look.